I'm very pleased to introduce you to Professor George Diamond. Dr. Diamond grew up in the New York City area,
That's right.
but he traveled all the way across Pennsylvania to attend a liberal arts college called Allegheny College, which is just south of Erie. But he got his doctorate at Lehigh here in the Lehigh Valley.
That's correct.
He came to Moravian as a member of the English department. I don't know if fixture is a really nice word.
Well, no, that's all right.
It's okay.
I don't mind that when you're
All right. So yeah. But anyway, he's been a fixture. He's been an important part of the faculty and the Moravian community for many, many years. He used to teach a course on science fiction called Prophets of Doom and Gloom.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
I was invited to talk about fossil fuels in that class, and so I'm happy to return the favor so that he can talk about one of our favorite subjects, Isaac Asimov.
Yes. So, since you brought up that class in science fiction, I asked all my friends to be visiting lecturers, and I had 10 of them. And two of them, Joe Paulette in physics and Jim Green in computers, claimed that I had so many guest lecturers that by Thanksgiving, my students still didn't know who the teacher was. But they were just bitter that they never thought about it. I prepared tremendously for this lecture, and I'm in my Moravian University garb. I came here when it was a college, that's a university. And my pen is Moravian University. I have a gold watch. My wife claims it's a cheap watch, but that they gave me when I retired. And I also have the hat, Mo. So I'm all set. If there's something, I probably have too much material for, how long is this class?
It's supposed to be about 60 minutes or so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I probably have too much material, but you'll get these notes. I'm going to give them to your secretary. Once last year it took me a half a term to get them. This time it should take a week. I'm talking about Isaac Asimov. Is he the only one you're reading?
He's it.
Okay. His dates are 1920 to 1992, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And I call him, this is my type, Isaac Asimov, scientist, science fictionist, and popularizer extraordinaire. Okay. And I will define all that. He was born in Russia and brought to this country at the age of 2. Let me see, he was born in 20. This is interesting. And I just thought of it now. My mother worked for the INS, for the Immigration and National Station Service at Ellis Island from around 1920 to 1934. So there's this little bright-looking kid being taken through, and she probably saw him, but she never told me. She had some great stories. He was brought to this country at 2 years of age and died sadly and tragically in New York at 72 years of age with an AIDS infection from tainted blood he received during a heart operation. And the same thing happened to Arthur Ashe, in the early days of AIDS. The word genius is thrown around in today's world too often. But in Asimov's case, it may have resonance. Now, most of you are too young to buy cars for yourselves, right? I mean, you don't walk into a dealership and buy a car. But when you do, you'll speak to a salesman, and he'll tell you that the chief salesman is a genius, which means they want to screw you out of as much money as they can. But genius is may have resonance in Asimov's case. During his lifetime, he wrote and published over 500 books and had a sharp influence on the thrust and development of science fiction itself and popularization, which I will define down the road. As to my 3 titles for Dr. Asimov, he had genuine credentials in science, a PhD from Columbia University, taught biochemistry in Boston, and wrote a textbook in that field and a number of other hard science books. He wrote numerous works in science fiction, some of them groundbreaking, and won numerous awards. He was a best-selling author and had works adapted for television and movies and translated into many languages. A popularizer, and I called him a popularizer extraordinary, is one who interprets a complex and difficult subject for the understanding of the general public. This is true in science and other fields. Often the popularizer is scorned outright by people in the field. I'll make reference at the end to Carl Sagan, who's an astronomer, and he did popularization also. And a lot of people, but the popularizer plays an important role in informing the public, which is often skeptical about what the scientist is up to. Asimov was a very successful popularizer. And I think one of the problems in academia and science today is that the scientific professions have done a poor job in explaining what they're doing to the public. I'm probably the only one in this class right now who remembers when the atomic bomb was dropped. I do remember it. It was August of 1945. And at first, we were so happy to be finished with the war. You know, it killed a lot of people. And then the war ended. I had two uncles and an aunt who were in the war. My aunt was in London during the Blitz. They were in harm's way. So we were ecstatic. It was only after people started thinking about it, about what is this atomic energy stuff, and and what is it effect is going to have. So Asimov was very successful in popularizing science and other ideas for people to understand. Although the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended World War II, the public became wary of scientists and what they were capable of creating. And you see many, if you're interested in old movies from the 50s, there are a lot of them. I suppose the most famous is Godzilla, the Japanese Godzilla. And all of this is a kind of an erotic response to what this new nuclear age was bringing. And of course, the Japanese were the chief recipients of that. But that's the story. Popularizers like Asimov helped explain their role in the post-war world. In 1960, Asimov published The Intelligent Man's Guide to Science. Its purpose was to provide an overview of science and its history to an intelligent but non-science reader. It was a great success, and I'll talk about that a little later. He was educated in the New York City school system, which was very good when he was growing up, at Columbia University Junior College, and then Columbia University itself. Throughout his life, he could never stop reading and writing. He absorbed much of what he encountered and was able to create fiction from it. It is worth noting that his family background played a large part in his intellectual development. His father was a devoted, sensitive gentleman who constantly told him stories. His mother was a difficult, quarrelsome, angry person. One of the qualities that often advances an artist is tension in his or her life. I don't know whether one of you readers or writers or painters or whatever. Very often, what advances your creativity is some kind of tension. Usually it's tension within the artist itself, but it can be a family problem, it can be tension with the society and all of that, or maybe a combination. And the tension in his home may have contributed to his development as a writer. I sometimes describe this tension like, they say, in order to get a pearl in an oyster, you have to have a grain of sand, which is near it. And that's what the tension is like. Asimov was Jewish, but was non-religious. Although he later described himself as an atheist, the Jewish tradition is a highly literary one, and he took much from that tradition. His father owned a candy store, or a series of them, and Asimov got the first crack in the magazines. In the 1920s and 1930s, saw the creation of magazines like Astounding Stories, Science Fictionist, and others. And although Asimov got hooked on them, they had a kind of transformative effect. They became part of his consciousness. And through them, he became a creator of his own story. When he reached maturity, he would describe himself as a humanist, Humanist. Now, what is that? Humanism is a philosophy, a very ancient philosophy, that begins with human beings and emphasizes the social potential and creative power of human beings, and sees human beings as a starting or beginning point of philosophy and morality. For believers, of course, God is the beginning point and aiming point, generally not for humanists. Throughout his creative life, it is humanism that shapes his attitudes and his belief in what might be called liberal causes. And just let me stop for a moment. One of the things that's peculiar about Asimov is that he was not simply, and this is big enough, a writer, but he was involved in causes and advancing ideas and so forth to make science, to make society better, more effective, more humane. So this humanism was certainly a part of his character. He also had what might be called an interest in liberal causes. Although some of these causes, such as opposition to the Vietnam War, which I'm sure for all of you is ancient history, right? And his dislike of Richard Nixon, you may have heard of Nixon, he was a president, are long over. As a young man of 18, he joined the Futurians, a sci-fi club, many of whose writers became prominent sci-fi writers. The Futurians were progressive and opposed to militarism, barbarism, all kinds of conflict. And he became a part of that. They called on science fiction to advance science and to help foster a more united and humane society. On an outlook, at least, he was an early feminist, although sometimes his relationship with women wasn't so good, but at least theoretically. Whether he ever kissed a woman athlete on the lips, I don't know, but that's supposed to be a joke. If he were alive today, he'd probably be on the side of what we call liberal causes, particularly saving the environment, and he would be especially outraged, and that's just like sure, by those who deny or disparage science and scientists. Now, I would like to step back, and I don't know whether you've done this before, and talk about science fiction before I get to Asimov's place.
We have it, because I was saving you that role.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about science fiction is that the definition is so broad that virtually everything fits in its power. There are many definitions of science fiction, but the most straightforward is science fiction is a genre, that's a type of fiction, and it includes poetry. There are science fiction poems, drama, film, television, video games, et cetera, that deal with the impact of real or imagined innovations in science or technology. So, science fiction is a type of fiction that deals with real or imagined innovations in science or technology. It also depicts space exploration by humans who go out from here or aliens who come to see us. Exploring the consequences of such innovations is the traditional purpose of science fiction, making it a literature of ideas more than emotional conflicts or other things or drama or whatnot. It's a literature of ideas. Although science fiction works seem to predict the future, in fact, science fiction is not necessarily an instrument of prophecy. More often than not, it provides a warning, not a prediction, a warning, not a prediction. And the two are not the same. I remember in 1984, a reporter from one of the local newspapers came to see me because she knew I taught a lot of science fiction. And she said, well, George Orwell wrote 1984 about the tyranny of this state and so forth. And she said, we don't have anything like that. And I pointed out to her that Orwell was not making a prediction. He was warning about what would happen. Okay, so keep in mind, whenever you're reading a science fiction work, no matter what it says, it may be more of a warning than a prediction of the economy. And I'm going to talk that back in a few minutes. Science fiction's definition is so broad that it is often associated with fantasy. And sometimes it is difficult to identify where science fiction ends and where the fantasy begins, or vice versa. For instance, Harry Potter, for instance, is fantasy, but it has science fiction elements to it. I don't know whether there are any Harry Potter people here. Also, the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis are fantasy, but have a lot of science fiction. It also includes science fiction variations, which don't seem to be science fiction, but are listed under it anyway. Don't ask me why, but that's what it is. There's something called alternate history. Alternate history. Well, if you read a book about Abraham Lincoln, it's a book of fiction. They call that historical fiction. Now, that's it. The phrase itself is what is called an oxymoron. The best oxymoron is jumbo shrimp. In other words, bringing two things together that seem to be opposite one another. And historical fiction, well, either something is historical or it's fiction. It can't be both, but it is. And so you have that historical fiction, which changes participants or outcomes, and to play with the idea of what would happen if so. For instance, there's a book by Philip Roth, who was a 20th century writer, very, very great writer, American writer, who wrote a book called The Plot Against America. Now, in the novel, Charles Lindbergh wins the 1940 presidential election, and not Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt was president from 1932 to 1945, the year he died. And he ran in 40. It was very controversial because nobody from George Washington ever run more than 2 terms. And this was his 3rd term, but it was in the middle of the war, so he ran. And but in this book, it's Charles Lindbergh that won. So that's historical fiction, and it's kind of interesting thing. Time travel is another. Time travel presumes that everything that's ever happened historically or in the future is taking place at that time. And I'm sure some of you know Back to the Future, Michael J. Fox, I think he had 3. So that's another thing that's under the rubric of science fiction. There's another type called the utopia and dystopia. Have any of you heard of utopia? You know what it is? You know what it is?
Yes, I do.
What's that?
Oh, it's like a perfect place where it's like everyone is equal and everyone is like equal and like nothing bad ever happens.
Yes, the dystopia is a perfect society. Actually, the first one was written by a man named Sir Thomas More. He later became St. Thomas More in 1516. A dystopia, D-Y-S-T-O-P-I-A, is a place that's perfectly horrible. And such as Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which was published in 1932, or George Orwell's 1984, which was published in 1949. So you're going to hear those words often when you read, about, science fiction, utopian, dystopian. But it really, it's a far stretch from the original definition of science fiction, but it's part of it. Science fiction may be thought of as having three beginnings. One in ancient times, the book of Genesis in the Bible. Eden is like a utopia until Eve. It's always men that blame women and all that. Eve ate the apple, right? And she gave part of it to Adam, and they both felt ashamed. Well, I mean, another is Plato's Republic. In 375 BC, he wrote a book called The Republic, and he was trying to answer the question of what is justice, and he wrote this terrific book. And then Thomas More, of course, in 1516. So that's one opening for science fiction. The second is the early Romantic period, starting with around 1800. And Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in 1818. Edgar Allan Poe, Descent into the Maelstrom. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Rappaccini's Daughter, 1844. So, in the beginning of the 19th century, of another opening of science fiction, and then in the 20th century, in the 20s and 30s, there were a group of magazines, Amazing Stories, Astounding Fiction, Scientific Fiction, a lot of others were published. And following the short stories, a flood of books came out, television shows, and so forth. And science fiction is so popular. And now, of course, with the computer, you do all kinds of things on the computer. Scientific elements can also be found in other varieties of works. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Ian Fleming's James Bond. I think he's still around here. And Tom Clancy wrote Jack Ryan stories. And these are from military political thrillers, but they have strong scientific elements, science fiction elements. So that's part of it. Special science fiction problems come in what we call evaluation. Now, this is a little tricky. So try to concentrate. Science fiction stories, dramas, novels can be criticized like any other story, drama, or novel. Is the theme good? Is the structure good? Does the language make sense? What is the characterization like? Setting, literary, artistic device, all of those things. Whether we're criticizing Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter or Isaac Asimov's I, Robot, we're looking at it as a literary work. And does the question that we ask it, does it measure up enough? Some works measure up and others don't. However, science fiction also can be evaluated on the quality of the science. Is it believable or possible in the novel? Kurt Vonnegut Jr., who spoke at Moravian some years ago, I don't know whether wrote a book called The Sirens of Type, in which he turns science fiction upside down and uses it for comic purposes. A spaceship crash lands on Titan, one of the moons of Saturn, and a part breaks down, and it turns out the part is a what we used to call in my day in college a church key, a beer can opener. And then one of the movies I used to show to my students in a science fiction class was a movie called Sleeper by Woody Allen, which is hilarious. It's about a guy who goes in for a gallbladder operation, falls asleep on the table on the operating table, and sleeps for 300 years, and then wakes up to a new world around him. And Alan uses all kinds of gags, some of which my students didn't understand, but a lot of them they did, and it's kind of fun. So we have to think about that when we read. Although Asimov wrote about humor, he wasn't necessarily a humorous guy, and so. But there are other science fiction people who use science fiction. Critics, and I think this is kind of important. Critics used to treat science fiction with scorn as a stepchild of serious literature, except for a small number of works, like 1984 and Brave New World. However, the May issue, May 2004, was a year before most of you were born. I think you were born. However, the May 2004 edition of a very prestigious journal, and you'll know what this is all about as you move along in college, called the Publication of the Modern Language Association, called the PMLA, devotes most of its edition to science fiction. And there's been a fair amount of critical acceptance since then. People went back and looked at various science fiction works and found out, yeah, there's a lot of substance here. Science fiction didn't change its basic nature, it just gained critical acceptance. So right now, science fiction works, and of course we see it all around us. And a lot of the stuff we see, particularly in movies, and I know they use comic book characters in movies like Ant-Man, all of that stuff. With a computer, they find a lot of the special effects easy to do. So it's used frequently for those types of things. I know when I was a kid, we didn't have, believe it or not, we didn't have television in radio. But, and of course, the iconic hero was Superman. But there was another hero named Captain Marvel. And Superman, and he was a mild-mannered reporter named Clark Kent. And when he wanted to be Superman, he walked into a phone booth. You know what that is? Had a phone, and would change into a Superman outfit. Did it very fast, so nobody saw him. Captain Marvel turned around in circles and said Shazam, and then turned into Captain Marvel. Now, I can't tell you how many times I went around in circles and said Shazam, but I never became. One of the great regrets. Okay, so that's the background of science fiction. There's obviously a lot more to say, and it's an enormous field, but it's one that's worth looking at because it tells us a lot about who we are, like all literature or all art. Now let's get back to Asimov, the writer. Returning to Isaac Asimov, I believe this places the writer secure for the following reasons. One, his genius and his ability to absorb all that is around him and transform it into readable content. Although he may not have written much about writing itself, and I still couldn't find.
Yeah, I've tried too.
He stressed clarity in his works, always clarity. He wanted his audience to understand what he was writing, and his ideas and his works are much stronger than his characters. It's interesting. There was a great American novelist. I don't know whether you've heard of him. His name was Henry James. Any of you heard of Henry James? He lived from 1843 to 1916. And he wrote a wonderful essay called The Art of Fiction, in which he advises young people who want to be writers or art or any kind of artist. And he says to them, try to be one on nothing is lost. Try to be one, and for those of you who may have an idea, like, try to be one on nothing is lost. In other words, absorb everything from the world around you. Be alive. And from that, create. And that's what, exactly. You find that people go through, and maybe they're lucky, they go through experiences, some of them good, some of them horrendous, and it doesn't have any effect. But for the sensitive writer, and that's why artists are very often neurotic. For the sensitive creator, you're affected by everything. You see the look on people's faces, the atmosphere around you. He had a very clever manner of transforming ideas into works that others would be interested in reading. He even produced works that seemed far from the realm of science and science fiction. Asimov's Guide to the Bible, Asimov's Guide to Shakespeare, Isaac Asimov's Treasury of Humor, 7 mystery novels, similar to what Agatha Christie did, 6 books on comedy, and a lecherous limericks. I have to get my hands on that one. Asimov's career as a writer seems to be divided into several periods, some of which are fixed, others seem to conflict with each other. His early career as a writer was dominated by short stories and novels from 1939 to the mid-1950s. By the time he was 21, he had a reputation as a writer of arresting short stories. And this was the experience when he was in his father's candy store. He used to read all of these science fiction magazines. And from that, he developed his own approach to writing. Obviously, you can read a story and then change the names or something else, but he had his own individual approach. From the mid-50s to the early 80s, he began publishing nonfiction from college texts to popular science books, and this greatly enriched his reputation as a writer and public figure. I think people recognized early that this guy was something more than simply a writer of stories for science fiction. There's something else going on. It is worth remembering that Asimov knew most of the major science fiction writers of the period, and the scientists as well. They respected him because he could communicate with them, and this led to his career as a public speaker. He was not arrogant, but had much self-confidence. In an interview, he once said, "I've never been accused of false modesty." And then he added, "Come to think of it, I've never been accused of true modesty." Although it was worth looking at the many works that reflected the richness of his creative outlook, I'm going to concentrate on Robot and Robotics, and if I get to it, the Foundation series that reflect his creative outlook and genius, and also make reference to the guide for the Intelligent Man's Guide for Science. Let me step back a little. I said earlier that although science fiction seems to predict the future, more often than not, it provides a warning, not a prediction. However, I'd like to step back from that shade and agree that many science fiction works are predictions which sometimes come uncomfortably close to reality. For instance, in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, published in 1932, Huxley describes how technology and applied science transform the world of nature, and his depiction of artificial reproduction horrified many. But of course, it's an industry in the modern world. In Huxley's book, sex is used as an amusement among people, and babies are created in hatcheries. And when Huxley, that was a brilliant tour de force. And when he came out to that, a lot of people were outraged by it. And of course, some people even wanted to ban the book. And for many authors, that's the greatest, that's the greatest thing. Of course, one of our leading authors in American literary history is Mark Twain. And when he wrote The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, it was banned in Boston. And Twain was really excited. He says, now it's going to be a bestseller. George Orwell in 1984, published in 1949, describes political tyranny and the corruption of language, which is much too close for comfort nowadays. Another writer named Philip K. Dick wrote a book called Do Androids Dream of Electronic Sheep? Do Androids Dream of Electronic Sheep? In 1968, from which come the movies Blade Runner. There are two of them, both with Harrison Ford. And they take place in a post-apocalyptic world. The atomic bomb has already fallen and left environmental catastrophe in its work. And of course, we're living through environmental catastrophe. Now, we don't know where that's going to take us. There's a wonderful writer from the Pacific Northwest. I think she died a couple of years ago, named Ursula K. Le Guin, who wrote a book called The Left Hand of Darkness in 1969. It's set in a world far from Earth and populated with humans, but they're ambisexual. In other words, each person contains both male and female sexes. And they go into heat once a month called Kemmer, and they either become a man or a male or a female. And of course, Le Guin, as so many science fiction, is ahead of her time here. And of course, we live in an age of what you might call sexual ambiguity or confusion. Now, there used to be just men. There used to be just males and females. And now there's Dr. Wetcher Hendricks in sociology. I don't know whether she's a buddy of mine. She says there's a whole array of sexual status that people have now, and that the fact that some people are confused by it is something to accept. Margaret Atwood, who's a Canadian writer, wrote a book called The Handmaid's Tale in 1985, and depicts a world where widespread infertility, fascist politics, and fundamental religion combine to create political tyranny, corrupts and oppresses all, but especially women and the powerless. So these writers, despite the fact that science fiction provides a warning, were awfully close to reality when they wrote their work. Where does that come from? Creative genius. I bring these writers up for a reason. Although each writer produced many works on different science fiction subjects, the substance of these works for each writer had a special resonance and popularity. Much the same way for Asimov. Although he produced a series of science fiction works and many nonfiction, his stories on robot and robotics, a word incidentally that he coined, were especially rich in creativity and inventive detail. He wrote 50 robot stories and 4 novels. I, Robot in 1950, The Caves of Steel in 1954, The Naked Sun in 1957, and he was working on a 4th novel in 1958 where something strange happened. The Russians, the Soviet Union, sent up a satellite called Sputnik, and that transformed the world. I'm sure you remember that. No, you don't?
No, I don't quite remember that. Because I was born in 1958.
Oh, so you wouldn't remember it?
No.
I remember in seeing the cover of Time magazine, a man of the year was Nikita Khrushchev, and he had sent up this, and it was a great coup. Finally, he completed the fourth novel in 1983 called The Robots of Dawn. And Dr. Salter was very kind enough to lend me here, showing. In discussing robots, the robot was a great subject for Asimov, because it allowed him to speculate about the technological byproducts that have infinite fictional applications and could be some human-like in its formation. So it's certainly a part of our society. And in discussing Asimov's robotic work, two things are very special to him. Asimov's creation of something called the positronic brain, which is a fictional technological device that functions as a CPU, a central processing unit, and in some vague and unspecified way provides it with a form of consciousness recognizable to humans. So it's a kind of, the positronic brain is a kind of a conscious brain, but it's not ever been clearly defined. So it's under. Does this mean that robots are actually conscious? That is a more confusing and difficult question, and one that has not been fully answered yet, and we're going to find out about it. Just to step back, robots have a definition that can be ambiguous. Originally, a robot was a machine capable of carrying out a complex series of actions automatically, such as the traffic light, the clothes washer, and many other automatic machines. Now, added to that definition is a machine that's been programmed by a computer. A computer is in that mix. And I was watching the news the other day. I don't know why I watch the news. I'm always depressed after I finish with it. There are evidently thousands of driverless cars on the road. And of course, they're robotic. You know, supposedly they're supposed to be a driver in case you get into trouble, and sometimes it's a horrendous thing. But the idea is that the car drives by itself. Now, whether I want to get in such a car is problematic. But you know, although the phrase artificial intelligence was not coined until 1905, it is clear in the development of Asimov's stories and novels that, in fact, intelligence or artificial intelligence evolves with them. And I think, as a scientist, that's something Asimov understood. That somebody's not gonna create artificial intelligence in 1955, and it's gonna stay that way. It's gonna evolve. In iRobot, the robot evolves from a silent babysitter to an election-winning politician. We certainly have some robotic politicians. Intellectually and artistically, this evolution is inevitable. What has grown out of machines and robots has been the anti-machine movement and the anti-robot movement. And this is not something new. There were a group of actually weavers in England between 1811 and 1816 called the Luddites, Luddites. And they were afraid that machines were going to replace them. In the present day, the fear is not that robots will gain political power, but that they will replace factory workers. And that's a much more down-to-earth problem. Back in the 60s, there was something called the United Auto Workers Union. In fact, as we speak, or as I speak, they're planning a strike. One of the things they were, the leaders of the union were the Reuther brothers, Walter Reuther. And they were afraid that machines would replace auto workers. Now, a friend of mine is a professor of artificial intelligence at the Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. Bright guy. And do any of you know what a TED Talk is? Some of you know what a TED Talk. TED Talk. Let me see. It's called Technology, Education, and Drama or something. And he's given a TED Talk. He takes a more open view. He believes that we can work together with robots, that they don't have to replace them. It's an interesting thing. In fact, he wrote an editorial for a Boston paper. Okay, the most famous, of course, of the robot novels is I, Robot, which is a short story cycle. Stories that could be read individually or together as one novel. In the work, Asimov is creating positronic robots, human-like in form and developing varying degrees of artificial intelligence. The term artificial intelligence, as I mentioned, comes from 1955 and was coined by a man at Stanford University, which is a pretty good place, named John McCarthy. In the series, the author is concerned with the moral implications of technology, and Asimov was way ahead of the curve. His book, and I took an unusual turn in that the creation of robots has an ethical quality rather than just being mechanical monsters. And this had a strong influence on science fiction itself. Robots play an important, ubiquitous role in our world, from manufacturing to medicine, and of course, in the military, plays a very strong role. I, Robot story have technically called, what they have is called a framing device. Some of you may be English majors, a framing device, or maybe some of them will be English chemistry majors, whatever. A framing device is a literary device that binds stories together. In this case, it is a person, Dr. Susan Calvin. She is a former robot psychologist for a great corporation whose work involves dysfunctional robots and robot-human interaction. So she's a psychologist for robots. So many of you have gone know the first robot psychologist. In each story, the robots became more clever and more sophisticated, pointing to new problems and challenges which humanity will have to solve. And I think this is one of the things that we get to with the essence of Asimov. He's presenting problems, and he's saying to people, pay attention. We're going to have to deal with this. What are we going to do? Asimov designed 3 laws of robotics and a special flowering of Asimov's humanism, a hope, a belief, an expectation that in the final analysis, science will be used for the good. The final analysis, science will be used for the good. And I know you heard what these 3 laws are. A robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Second, a robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first and second laws. And it's I think, reflective of Asimov, that he took the time to come up with this story. These laws seem simple and straightforward. However, as we see in the 4 novels, I, Robot, Caves of Steel, The Naked Sun, and Robots of Dawn, all kinds of complications, nuances, make the 3 laws sometimes difficult to fulfill. In some ways, these laws are much more of a hope than anything else. Sadly, the laws at best are an ideal and a wishful thinking. Given the propensity of smart bombs, killer drones, and other lethal devices, we have to go far to go to achieve the human values Asimov wanted for all his robots. Let me eliminate, I've written about the Caves of Steel, The Naked Sun, and the Robots of Dawn. And just tell you, that in all of these books, of course, a novel has an entertainment value to it. Sometimes great, sometimes less. But in all of these books, Asimov is asking profound questions about where are we going as a species. And in many cases, the humans that populate the novels want the robots to do the work, and they want to live their own lives separated from everything. That's not the four robot novels, and as I say, when I distribute these notes, I'll discuss the other one. The four robot novels, in ways peculiar to themselves, affirm Asimov's values and his writing skills. They affirm his humanism and his positive and appropriate human values. His ability to deal with complex ideas in a work of fiction. His understanding of the world of robotics and where it might be leading us into unintended and unexpected places. And we don't know what's going to happen. You know, we think we do, and we sometimes predict. Are we right? Are we headed to dark, dangerous robotic times? Time and technological developments and the choices we make will be the deciding factor. I want to say a few words about the Foundation series. This series began as a group of short stories, and then a trilogy of novels, and then two prequels and sequels and prequels and so on and so forth. So it's very hard to add them up. They were set in the same fictional universe that other of his series were set, so Asimov could make reference to them and connect the works together. The series won the Hugo Award, which is a very prestigious award in science fiction, for best all-time series. A Foundation is based on the uncertainty principle of sociology. If a population gains knowledge of its predicted behavior, its self-aware collective actions become unpredictable. I'm not going to go over that again. So anyway, we have in this novel a galactic empire, which is going to collapse, and there's going to be a 30,000 year development of a dark age, and you'll read it over, and it's certainly worth reading, and he comes up with some interesting ideas, although they violate some of the principles of science. The essence of the series was the progress of civilization and how, using history as a precedent, how progress might be analyzed and understood. He also wrote The Intelligent Man's Guide to Science in 1960, and Not Science for Dummies. The title of the book title sounds sexist, but actually not, because it's George Bernard Shaw, who's a great English dramatist, wrote a book called The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Socialism and Capitalism. So this was a kind of variation. The prospect of the book seemed overwhelming, but once he delved into the subject, he thought it was an interesting approach, and he said it was very popular, and it told a lot of people who are interested in science which way science was going, so it was worth it. So I'm not going to talk in essence about that. I will say this. Asimov was much concerned about public ignorance, especially ignorance about science. An ignorant public could only make poor choices in the age of scientific progress and complexity, and this would be harmful to the nation and the world. He had a special affection for The Intelligent Man's Guide to Science, and it was published in the Times. Okay, now assessing, I have about 5 minutes left. But let's assess Asimov. Asimov spent a good part of his life breaking down the make-believe boundary between imagination and reason. He believed that the work of the artist suffers if he or she has insufficient knowledge of the world. In much the same way science suffers, if intuition is lacking in the scientists. Rationality can often be plodding and backward-looking. Asimov believed that scientists can make leaps into realms of knowledge by looking at the universe with the eyes of the artist. So rather than seeing art and science and separate spheres, he brought them together. But he was talking about something more than research, exploration, and learning and communicating. He believed in an ethical imperative, a moral obligation essential for human progress in scientific exploration. He was often compared to another popular person you may have heard of, H.G. Wells. His dates are 1866 to 1946, who wrote The Time Machine in 1895, The Invisible Man, 97, The War of the Worlds, 98. And he had a deep thirst for knowledge and saw his study and writing as adventure and curiosity. It is worth noting that Asimov never created extraterrestrial aliens, little green men from outer space in his work. He was discouraged from doing so by older, more experienced science fiction writers, especially since alien presence dominates early science fiction magazines. However, extraterrestrial aliens are a staple in a number of scientific works. H.G. Wells, Steven Spielberg, E.T. and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, George Lucas, the whole Star Wars series, and other important creators. He was especially attracted to robots and robotics, which gave him an opportunity to exercise his creative impulses, and on a subject that had genuine and growing presence in the contemporary world. Asimov came to believe that eventually technology as a social institution would entangle with politics and economy as well, and every other human endeavor, and it sure so has. He also became suspicious and skeptical about social institutions, and I have to say religions as part of that, and their conflict with progress of all kinds. In his works, science fiction depicts the center of social conflict in society. Human creativity and ingenuity face off against prevailing historical forces and cultural patterns. My conclusion: as he grew as a writer, Asimov's work became more technically sophisticated to embrace the computer revolution and the space age. In other words, he kept up with the times. By early 20th century, science fiction magazines emphasized ray guns and characters in look and action and fantastical and probable plots. Asimov's work involves an ingenuity and maturity. The older he got, the more he writes, the more sophisticated and mature his work becomes. This is not necessarily so. Sometimes writers are stuck in a time period and never grow out of it. But the most intelligent and sophisticated writers their work keeps evolving. And that's his. His story Nightfall, which was voted one of the greatest science fiction stories ever written, tells a tale of a planet illuminated by 6 suns, facing a devastating psychological collapse when it faces a total eclipse every 2,000 years. And what he's getting to in Nightfall is a definition of Earth's own cosmic insignificance. And Nightfall, of course, is a very sophisticated story, a far cry from ray guns and space cowboys in earlier science fiction. In an interview in 1988, Asimov asserted that science is tentative, that it is not certain, and often subject to change. I think that's very interesting. He believed no scientific voice could have the last word, and the public has a special responsibility to listen carefully, He was a staunch critic of intolerance, pseudoscience, and superstition. He believed that in his own time, secular reasoning and critical thinking were diminishing. And he said this: that the saddest aspect of life right now is that science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom. And I think that's interesting. He was deeply concerned about the environment in which humans live because of unrestrained harmful attacks on society and the environment had reached a global scale. The reverence for limited growth and tribalism persisted. Instead of solving dangerous problems, antiquated parochial beliefs and local conventions persisted and worked against human progress. So we saw a conflict between the past and the present. In the 1970s, he's already writing about the decline, atmospheric pollution in all its forms, leading to all manner of natural catastrophes. He also saw that was once good common sense degenerating into suicidal myth, which is, I think, interesting. He called for global solutions to global problems, and if you're living now, he would certainly be in the environmental camp, and believe that humanity must be united by a common aim to save itself. After he died, the astronomer Carl Sagan called him one of the great explainers of the age, motivated by a profoundly democratic impulse. Isaac Asimov was a genuine, profoundly motivated, and highly productive individual. He certainly left science fiction and all knowledge enriched by his presence. Thank you. I'll stay a few minutes if you have any questions you'd like to ask.
Yeah, sure, Melissa.
Oh, that, well, I have a sort of affection for Robbie, because he's non-threatening, you know. But they're all extremely interesting. They tell us that, you know, we can kind of look into Asimov's mind and see that mind, and he realized that things weren't going to stay there, that they had to evolve. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Does anybody else have any questions? Thanks for telling us that Robbie was your favorite, because I didn't know that actually.
Well, no, it is.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll have a lot of things to talk about. Thanks to your talk and your lecture notes, and we'll look at some more things about robots in the near future. And in fact, I believe either on Tuesday or Thursday of next week, we will actually try to do a little writing assignment in class. What is a robot? And just as soon as I can, I will distribute Dr. Diamond's lecture notes to you.
Right.